Thank you for joining XROM, which is India's first AR/VR focused podcast. And today I'm delighted to have with me Bilawal Sidhu, who's passionate about creating platforms and experiences that blur the physical and digital worlds. He's a self taught 3D artist, a content creator, immersive tech evangelist, and a podcaster. Ex senior product manager at Google Maps, where he led the product for Google Geo's 3D mapping platforms, where he and his team built one of the most complete digital twins of a planet powering global scale AR and 3D applications. Before Maps, he was a PM and technical producer on the Google's AR VR teams. And before Google, he led product strategy and design for Fortune 500 emerging tech and AR VR engagement at Deloitte. So, Bilal, really appreciate you taking time being part of the podcast. Now, your journey has been super exciting. You started out from India, as an intern at KPMG Advisory to
Yeah.
Google, product manager, and you've done so many things, from live action to 3D mapping to AR, VR, nerves, generative AI. Would you like to share your journey? Because I mean and maybe possibly some insights, or advice, so that other content creators, who would want to follow along your lines.
I would say, I was lucky in that I figured out what I wanted to do early in life. And what I mean by that is like at 11, I really got into visual effects. And honestly, I discovered it by watching cable TV. I mean, I used to watch this TV show on Discovery Kids called Mega Movie Magic, where they would show and deconstruct basically iconic scenes in movies. And the one I vividly remember capturing my imagination was the scene in Independence Day, the 97 movie, where it's like the mothership in New York and it just like blows everything to smithereens. I got so enamored by that because they were showing how they were using computers to make that type of imagery. And all I had seen at that point was like stuff like Toy Story, this Pixar stylized aesthetic of the world. And I was just enraptured by the fact, and I was already learning Flash 5 at the time and like basic web design stuff. It's like, wait, you can do this with a freaking computer? How is like, I need to learn the sorcery. And so that started my journey with visual effects, and kind of what I call it is blending reality and imagination. And that's kind of stayed the theme. Even when you think about augmented reality is basically the visual effects pipeline running in real time on the phone in your pocket or the headset on your face. And honestly, the same thing with 3D maps, where maybe it's the more utilitarian version of that mission. Instead of like blending reality and imagination, it's more about sort of what you said, which is like blending the physical and the digital worlds, right? And so that is such a key prerequisite in it. Looking back at that journey, sort of, if you'd asked me at 13, what did I want to do when I grow up? I would have said, I want to be a VFX supervisor. I want to work at Industrial Light and Magic. I want to go to film school. And obviously I did none of those things. I ended up studying computer science and business. And as I graduated college, which was around 2013, sort of, product design was where I fueled all my love for computer graphics because, mobile apps were blowing up at that time. And this was like the first wave, some people might say the second wave of AR and VR. Not the 80s and 90s wave, but like the early 2000s, the early 2010s, I should even say, like Google Glass before machine learning was really a thing. So I was able to kind of take that passion for blending the physical and digital world, or that whimsical version of it, or more delightful version of blending reality and imagination, and kept applying it to sort of new industries and new domains, whether that was enterprise AR, VR, or platform 3D maps, or consumer 3D maps. And so one thing I would say is, first off, follow your passions. Don't take on passions because you think they're lucrative. I think that's the biggest mistake people could make, because I still remember I used to like go take these like freaking classes at the Maya Academy of Advanced Cinematics. It had opened up in my town in Chandigarh back then. And so I was lucky enough that, oh my God, I could even go and learn these tools. But I remember my parents, especially my granddad, is like, oh, beta, like this is not going to do, like, how are you going to make money, basically? And they were right. Like, I don't think working at a visual effects studio would have resulted in sort of the same monetary outcomes I've been able to have working at a company like Google. That's for sure. But I think like if I had let go of that passion, I don't think I'd be where I am today. And so the second piece of advice I would say is like, whatever passions you have, apply them in novel ways to the world that we live in. Because right now what you're seeing is the ultimate convergence, sort of the current one being sort of creativity and technology is, intersecting to a degree that has just not been possible before. And then the third and final piece of advice I'd say is like, it's never too late to get started. Now I'm super happy that, like almost 400K on YouTube and almost 1 million on TikTok. And I don't think like it's ever too late to get started. So that's a little bit about my journey and some pieces of advice along the way.
Lovely, Bilawal. How cool is that? Rightfully pointed out, it's never too late to start. If you love something, don't wait. I mean, it's never too late. And you said follow your passion. That again is so very important, because at least here in India, I think most of the parents, they kind of push their kids towards picking up a space where it's more economically lucrative, and even though the kid is aligned somewhere else. So in the long run, if you take that path, and maybe you have the funds, maybe you have the money and nice big car, but then you'll never be happy. So I think following passion is such an important advice. And in the course of the conversation, you mentioned that Independence Day, the movie, the huge alien spacecraft explosion, and at that point in time, you're surprised that computers could create that, but then today that's kind of changing. Today computers are creating it by just prompts. You can put in some prompts and it doesn't just create these images, it creates 3D, 2D images. Also, there are startups who are doing, text to game, text to video. What would be your advice in a scenario like this? This is 2023,
Mhm.
What would be your advice to emerging content creators, production houses, Bollywood studios, and those legacy entertainment companies which are sitting tight, thinking that it's going to be business as usual?
I think what is clear with all the technologies you mentioned is that there is this sort of like barrier that has existed with visual creation, where you have had to learn a set of prerequisite skills. And even to get that final image, there was this whole like sort of waterfall pipeline you had to go through, right? Like, oh, let's make the concept, let's do the modeling, then the texturing, then the rigging, then the animation, then the lighting, then the compositing. Then I don't know, like 100 revisions later, maybe you get the thing. And now you can kind of go from concept to very close to final result very quickly. And sure, that's like, I think reached a high degree of fidelity today for text to image with examples like Midjourney V5, and I think V5.1 just dropped earlier today. And the pace there is relentless. And I think to your point, it'll quickly translate over to, temporally consistent text to video, and then very quickly text to, interactive experiences, right? Like that's an inevitability. That's going to happen. So what does that mean for both of these groups of folks? I think it means that there's this immense force multiplier that's now applied. You don't need to learn all this crap, like I think about this ill-tailored tapestry of tools I've had to learn growing up. And I'm so happy that the next generation doesn't have to endure that, right? Because why did these tools emerge? They emerged because the world we live in thus far is one where you need to specialize in the creative professions. Hey, you're like the best character animator on the planet, or you're the best visual effects compositor on the planet. And I think where we're heading into a phase now is like a world where generalists thrive the most, because it's sort of like the canonical T-shaped thing you hear about, like, hey, you got to be like broad, but you got to go deep in one area. The thing is, like, AI kind of turns every T-shaped person into a tripod or a table. It gives you those other legs of support that you may not intrinsically have had or built. So if you're a writer, you can suddenly start creating visual content. If you're a visual creator and you learn Photoshop, Procreate, and working with Wacom tablets, you can use something like ControlNet to really start orchestrating real worlds, or something like Gen 1 and Gen 2, start making animations, right? And then like kind of on and on it goes. And I think even directors are put in such a unique position, because if you have an idea as a director, now you can kind of treat these models as different roles that would play in a conventional team and kind of orchestrate them to produce an end output, right? So at the very least, you can go from idea to like a proof of concept way faster than ever possible before, right? And so that has this 10x multiplier effect. Now let's close this out by saying, like, what does this mean for both of those groups? I think for people who are coming into the industry today, it's sort of like when people were in film school and they were still teaching sort of like, hey, we'll just teach you how to like actually record film with like a film camera, and teach you like how to do like you know, like editing by like linear editing, the opposite of non-linear editing, by like cutting actual film on an editing board. I think we're in a similar position today where it's like I would encourage up and coming creators to learn the tools that they're interested in, but also like throw themselves into things like Unreal Engine as a 3D engine backend and all the generative tools out there, and just start integrating that into your workflow. Because what's going to happen is an individual is going to be able to rival the output of a studio. And then on the studio end, they'll set new standards altogether. At the very least, all of this supercharges content creation. But I think the more interesting question, which I don't have the answer to today, but is worth thinking about, is how will all this technology not just make it easy to create the content we all know and love and distribute the ways we do it, but how will it change consumption altogether? Is this going to accelerate that trend towards personalization? Are we going to have like crazy tentpole experiences still? I don't know the answers to that question, but it's like too big of an opportunity and too massive of a shift to ignore in either case.
Right. So obviously, there are a lot of opportunities for those who are willing to understand this transition that we are on, this content creation transition, from where we break or 2D barriers and enter the 3D world, and how these tools, generative AI tools, can augment or at least give us some kind of a references of what needs to be produced. But while we're doing this, there's going to be some kind of a disruption also. So maybe can you talk to the disruption bit? Because you mentioned that individual creators are going to get more potent or similar capabilities as studios. How does it pan out? So what's the future? I know it's a very vague question, but it's something I think all content creators, studios, production needs to be aware, because there is going to be a lot of opportunity, there is going to be a lot of disruption. So would you have like a overview on something like this, how it pans out?
There has been this trend towards personalization, right? So let's think about how is content historically made? Well, a bunch of companies aggregate around this patch of land called Hollywood, Bollywood, whatever, various film industries across the world. And that was sort of this like gravity well of talent, technology, and artistry that resulted in, the movies we've got today. And what an amazing library of content. But there was sort of this like oligopoly effectively of like a handful of production houses that would make one size fits all content, right? Like we got to make this movie, and this movie has to appeal to like every possible demographic, right? Even Hollywood is becoming increasingly international. Bollywood is becoming increasingly internationalized, right? If you see sort of the collaborations happening with Disney and so forth around creating this like Marvel style, universe around like ancient, like Vedic traditions or something like that. I think that's very interesting, but that's sort of still one size fits all content. Then two key milestones on this has been YouTube and then TikTok. So let's break that down. YouTube. All right, well, here's like a multi-billion user platform, and maybe less than 1% of creators now, like 1% of users of that platform started actively creating content. Meaning that they went through the drudgery of learning, how to wrangle a DSLR, deal with SD cards, lighting, audio recording, all the stuff that you need to do, Premiere editing, motion graphics, all the stuff you need to do to make compelling content. But we saw on YouTube sort of these genres of content emerge that would have never been funded by the traditional studio model, right? And so that's still less than 1% of YouTube users who were creating content. Enter TikTok, right? Really blowing up circa 2019, or other forms of short form content. Instagram Reels is huge in India, obviously. You got YouTube Shorts and so forth. Suddenly it was more like 30, 40, 50, 60% of users were now incentivized to create content. There was no longer this like sort of blank screen problem. You could solve that with like a bunch of seasonal trends. Like, I don't know if you remember the ice bucket challenge like a while back. Like there was this thing that lasted for months on YouTube and Facebook, right? Now on TikTok and Reels and Shorts, you'll have a trend come and go during a week, but people jump on these trends, create content. And that also resulted in a rise of a new type of content and a new type of creator that wouldn't have bothered ever learning all the crap that I grew up learning, right? And so like, if you take that to the next extreme, where visual vocabulary is suddenly no longer gatekept by like, oh, I need to learn like Nuke, and like I need to learn like Houdini and all this other crap, and I can just go into like Gen 2 and type in like crazy simulation of like an explosion, and it does it for you, bypassing God knows how long people spend learning Houdini. Like I failed thus far, and like it's gonna result in a new type of content, right? The thing I'm unsure about, and I have a cop out answer here, is like, is it just going to be hyper personalized content at the edge? Like if you really turn this up to an extreme for disruption, right? If you turn this up to an extreme, it could be that we go into this sort of somewhat dystopian future where you have a TikTok style recommendation algorithm that's completely interest based, and you're creating content on the edge for you as a user. And like, we talk about Mr. Beast retention editing. Well, you don't need to worry about retention editing because you could do the retention editing in real time to keep the engagement high. I don't think that'll be the only future that happens. I think creators will still be in the loop. And I also think there will still be tentpole productions because we as humans have sort of told the same stories over and over again over time, like sort of the campfire analogy, if you will, like the hero's journey. And so I think there will be a space for kind of content that we as a community like to watch. Hey, did you watch season X of the Bloody Blah show? And we want to feel the need to comment and react on it. So when I see this trend happening, I think personalization will be one dial that gets cranked up. At the same time, kind of these more tentpole stories will be told of things that might never have been funded before. And in particular, that makes me very excited about what this means for like the Indian market, to be honest, because I think there's so many stories that just haven't been told in a more easy to understand way for an international audience. So those are some thoughts on sort of the disruptions that may lay ahead.
You just gave a recent talk, TED talk, the talk was titled Generative AI and 3D. Could you kind of give a brief overview on the talk?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of what we discussed in the intro, which is basically like my lifelong quest to just blend reality and imagination and sort of outlining the crap I had to learn to make that stuff happen and sort of all the prerequisites required. And then the various ways different classes of generative AI tools are changing that, both on the reality capture side, right? Like first to reskin the world and augment it, you need to encapsulate the world and understand what's in the world, the structure of the world, the semantics of the world, so forth. And so obviously neural radiance fields are a really interesting technology that have blown up over the last 2 or 3 years in that space, taking sort of like supercharging photogrammetry, which has been this art and science of measuring stuff in the world using images and other sensors like LiDAR. And it's been around since like the 1800s, right? Which is kind of wild. And so we're on this like crazy asymptotic, moment of like progress in reality capture. So that's one piece. Digitizing reality suddenly far more commodity. You don't need data centers. You can do it with a phone in your pocket and like some AWS instances, or hell, your NVIDIA GPU, right? Like with Instant NGP, which blew my mind last year. Like what took like 12 hours on like some beefy TPUs, you could just train a 3D representation from the ground up in frickin', a minute on like a prosumer grade NVIDIA GPU. That blew my mind. So that's reality capture. On the other hand, all this like, I think text to image is cool, but the thing that I fell in love with in terms of prompting models is being able to prompt them with imagery and different types of imagery. So ControlNet obviously is a huge innovation in this regard, where you can take this like frozen snapshot of like Stable Diffusion or whatever flavor of Stable Diffusion you like, and then have this sort of like, purpose-built model that's taking advantage of purpose-built, kind of tasks in computer vision, such as depth estimation, edge detection, normal map estimation, and so forth, to guide this AI image generation process. And so when I think about like decomposing a 3D capture into like the texture information and the depth information, and then plumbing that into something like ControlNet, it literally gave me the ability to reskin reality, sort of in this 2.5D fashion, but still in a very temporally consistent, structurally coherent way. So I walked through a bunch of my experiments in that, and then finally closed out with what I've been playing with recently, which is Wonder Dynamics. Gosh, I love this tool, which is like, as you mentioned in the intro, like I worked on a bunch at augmented reality, Meta, Apple, all these companies have been working in AR. And what's been funny is a lot of these like really advanced computer vision capabilities have been subsidized to do like silly AR filters. It's like, oh, yo, just real time rotoscoping and lighting estimation and motion tracking so that you can make a like funny, filter on Snapchat or whatever. And so those like all that like, kind of VFX talent, like especially on the research side, ended up in these companies and fueling stuff, into these like consumer products. Meanwhile, like actual creators are sitting around with Adobe, clickety clacking away, doing all the usual crap, or Autodesk tools, not really benefiting from all these innovations that have been happening. Wonder Dynamics is so interesting to me because they're not just thinking about reality capture, they're thinking about performance capture. And how do you turn video into this super immaculate way of doing performance capture, almost following this like this Descript style model where, hey, we'll have the simplicity of AR. We'll run like 25 ML models in the cloud and give you this amazing final result. But then you can go in and tweak every little thing that you want. And so I think like today, I think about that 11-year-old, they don't have to go do all that crap again, right? Like it's like you jump into something like Wonder Dynamics, you take your iPhone or your Canon DSLR with a nice lens, you go out, shoot that movie on the weekend, and like on Monday, you've got this awesome edit you've got on YouTube, ready for people to give you feedback. I just can't wait to see what the James Cameron of like the next generation looks like, right? It's just so exciting. Like this is tech that James Cameron frickin' only dreamt of in the 2000s, and like was spending like millions and millions of dollars in R&D to pull off Avatar 1, and God knows how long Avatar 2 took, like shit, like 5 or 6 years. I don't, maybe even more. Actually, what is it? I was like, how long did Avatar 2 take to make? Let's see. 12 years. Okay. What is the 12-year-old going to do with 1 year now, given these tools? So that's kind of what the talk was about. And, I'm super excited about this democratization and kind of seeing what the next generation of creators do with these set of tools.
Right. Exciting as well as scary. You've been part of Google, and you've played a role, from shooting VR content to AR activation to nerfs you mentioned to Google Maps. Could you talk about some of the interesting works that you've built over there? Maybe give some examples.
Sure. Yeah, I would say let's pick 3 highlights. I think 3 highlights were number 1, working on VR camera systems and sort of the creation tools to supercharge post-production. So this is like circa 2017, 2018, in the early days of VR camera platforms. I would say still, Google built the best omnidirectional stereo capture platform out there with the Jump and the Yi Halo. So basically being able to take an array of, commodity sensors and creating this amazing like 5.2K, or 8K resolution, omnidirectional, like 3D 360 video, stereoscopic 360 video. It's just absolutely immaculate. One-click stitching, ability to take like low dynamic range sensors and hallucinate and create a high bit depth, final output for you, like literally pumping out amazingly crispy depth maps using, this is like the early days of multi-view stereo, which is funny to me because it's like, oh yeah, now you could do this with like a single image in your phone, and we needed like a bunch of sensors, and that was like not that long ago. But this ability to kind of capture reality in this immersive way that gave content creators a bunch of like awesome capabilities. So like live streaming, Coachella was definitely a highlight with that, 2018. Working with top creators like Shutter Authority on YouTube, who's also Daisy, by the way, was some amazing stuff. We made this like temple run experience that I think is still one of the best VR experiences on YouTube. Obviously, So Crispy Media did such a killer job with a bunch of this stuff. And all these primitives that like I had the opportunity to work on with such an amazing team, like just turned them up to 11. Like, hey, let's use the lighting estimation capability from these VR camera sensors to like create some amazing 3D plus live action creations. So that was one. The next one that was really, really fun was augmented reality. Like, like I said, augmented reality to me is VFX pipeline running in real time on the phone in your pocket. And one of the coolest things to work on there was the visual positioning service. Like, and the Geospatial API, which we announced at Google I/O last year. Absolutely fascinating capability to be able to take like 12 years of Street View, 12 years of like aerial imagery, perhaps the most complete digital twin of the world, and create this 3D substrate for developers in 100 countries to attach AR content to it, right? Like, So this is something developers can play with today, available at no cost, by the way, to developers. Absolutely wild capability. I don't think anything else in the market even comes close from any of the other players in terms of just sheer quality and ubiquity. You can get like sub-meter accuracy and a couple for positional localization and a couple degrees for rotational. And so I believe this is like already we've done some really cool stuff with this, like with the Gorillaz, for example, taking over parts of London and taking over parts of New York. That's all cool. And there's a bunch of other cool things happening on the utilitarian end too, with micromobility companies like Lime and Bird, basically, being able to ensure that parking is done on sidewalks in the right place. So you just take a photo, yeah, you parked in the right place, or no, you didn't. Actually, can you move it over here? That type of feedback loop. But I think that's just scratching the surface. So I think it's been an amazing experience to work on this like foundational primitive. Shout out to Simon Leinen and his VPS team. Just like phenomenal freaking job of like the core tech here. And then the labs teams for helping create this platform on top of it. And the beauty of it to me is like, this is going to be an underpinning layer for whatever comes next with glasses, right? Whatever comes next with headsets, whatever comes next with asynchronous content, just to be able to connect the physical and digital. And then the final and the last thing I worked on that I was just like, has kind of been like the last 3.5 years of my life has been like, if that was like the machine readable model of the world to help you localize your phone sensor, you need this human readable model too, right? Like something that's like super transportative that makes you feel like you're actually at a place. And of course, Google Earth has existed. What comes next, right? And so immersive view is what comes next. It's like, let's take again this like immaculate model of the world, fuse it together to create this like next generational digital twin that's semantically classified and really optimized for human understanding versus machine understanding. And then layer in all of Google's knowledge about the real world, real-time traffic, real-time weather. And of course, you gotta, like, how do you get a lay of the land? You get a lay of the land, then you want to go down a ground level and then obviously take a look inside, right? That's how you, in quotes, do the vibe check, as Gen Z likes to call it. And for the vibe check, neural radiance fields were the perfect technology. So when you go inside these places, these are all awesome nerfs, and those nerfs will propagate across the experience over time. So those are the three experiences that have been super fun, kind of more entertaining than AR, and then more like, if geospatial API is like AR where you're at, immersive view is more about, kind of VR where you're not.
Lovely. How cool is that? So I got into virtual reality somewhere around 2016, and when Google was doing the jump and Halo, and that's when we kind of built out our own 16 camera rig and are direct to produce India's first telescopic VR horror short film called Crackle. Cool. And yes, I think the content creation process itself, I think is going to get upended. So Bilawal, would you have any advice for newbies who want to get into possibly maybe like AR, VR, or understanding nerves or generative AI? Where do they start from?
There's only one place, YouTube University. That's like, I think that's like the best place to go. And Twitter, to be honest. I think Twitter is like a place where you go for breath and you can kind of, drink from the fire hose of innovations that are happening. But then I think it's important to go deeper into those things on platforms like YouTube. But the advice I would give, especially people starting out, whether you're established or early in your career, is to just have an open mind about this tech. Like, I think I empathize with sort of the visceral response to change that's happening. And certainly I think the era we're living in, the biggest difference between, people draw the analogy to, it's just like industrialization. We've done this before. Like, we'll adapt. It's like, well, I think the rate at which change is happening and the timeline within which the change is happening is so compressed that I think there's the whole question of like, can we create jobs at a rate that is greater than the rate at which jobs will be eliminated? I think that's a valid question. And maybe what that means for most creative professionals or even technologists is like, how does our job evolve and, along the way? And so I think the first thing I would say, maybe the only piece of advice, is just be adaptable and keep an open mind about this stuff. Like, there's probably a timeline in which I'm like, well, I grew up learning all these tools and it required real skill. And like, now people just type in a text prompt and they can make 3D. Like, this isn't real art. Like, screw this. Or I could say, hey, oh crap, I can go from text to 3D. What is this like newer canvas, for which I can create that I couldn't possibly have executed these ideas because I'd be wrangling frickin' vertices in Maya, right? Like, so I think there are two ways to look at this, and just look at it from like how does this force multiply your output and allow you to create things that you just couldn't have in the past, and do it at a rate, that you just couldn't have done in the past. And keep an open mind to it, because I think we're going to have to keep adapting at like more and more compressed timelines as this technology advances.
Right. And you rightfully pointed out, I think the internet is the new teacher. And yeah, if you have an intent and desire, there is loads of education out there to learn and create a career out. And to the point of obviously, automation, uh, I think we getting into a world that today, I mean, we're leveraging these tools, and obviously, I mean, the ones who are lifelong learners will be able to kind of learn and create the preferred futures. There's also that other lot who are averse to change and will not be looking at tech Luddites, who oppose tech. So I worry about that lot, and I also think about what's the timelines between AI creating complete hits or arts like the best in the world, and what would the world look like if that happens? So taking that question, I mean, I would want to understand also your views on big tech versus startups, because at one point in time you also pointed out, like, there are individuals who are becoming as potential as organizations. So what stands true in the future? I mean, these big techs versus small individuals, developers.
Yeah, I mean, let's take the second question first, and then the first one, because it's more philosophical. I think the second one is like, my sentiment is that we're going to end up having the current world, the configuration the current world has fallen into, will be sort of what will remain. What do I mean by that? I think there will be a small number of extremely large companies creating extremely regulated, AGI systems. Think of these at these like massive foundational models that will undoubtedly be too powerful to be, you're just not going to want to open source and put the weights out on like a frickin', GitHub repo for this type of stuff. I think that's going to be true. And then we're going to have this like sort of plurality of personalized models that some work at the edge, some personalized to you yourself specifically. Some will be very large models, but they'll sort of be like, they'll live together. And I think that's kind of the world we have today, where you've got a bunch of companies that sort of form the foundational platforms, if you will, whether that's things like YouTube or, the iOS App Store or whatever. And then people are building businesses on top of that, right? So I think that's kind of what's going to continue to be the case. I think it's a good question if like the current incumbents are the ones that are going to be, like the ones, still being the incumbent in 5 or 6 years. I don't know. Like, who knows? But I've got a feeling things will stay the way they are. And maybe, there'll be like, a little bit of a forward and backward. I kind of view this as like IBM, like, no offense to IBM. IBM's a great company, but the decline of IBM was exceedingly slow, right? So if I think of any company, whether that's Meta, Google, whatever, assuming they play all the bad moves and don't manage to, which is a big if, right? Like, people underestimate proprietary data, people underestimate talent and compute. And both of those companies have all of those things. I would say slightly more bullish on Google than Meta, given like, Meta's like only now pivoting to generative and AI stuff and amalgamating efforts together. Whereas like Google's like basically led all the foundational research in this space. And now they just need to operationalize some of the stuff that's sitting in the pantry shelf, if you will. So that's how I think the model will play out, where like you're going to have these like big tanker ships, and then you're going to have these speedboats. And I think people then need to make a decision of like, where do they want to operate, right? And so like, before the break, you asked me about my experience. Like, I would say like personally, I think like there are certain types of projects you can only do on the tanker ship, right? Where else are you going to have access to geospatial imagery of the whole freaking world? Maybe there's 3 or 4 players, some of them, private sector, some of them public sector, where you could play with data sets like that. and be able to do something that like touches billions of users. I think that's like always going to be the case. You're going to want to have to do like maybe a couple tours on these like massive tanker ships, right? But of course, there's the organizational tax of large companies. You have to move slower, but the impact is higher. So that's sort of the trade-off. But if you're on a speedboat, you know, you can move way fast, but obviously like sort of the waves that you can make and the magnitude of those waves is going to be significantly smaller. It's more targeted. It's a question of like, do you want to be in like this massive, in quotes, army, or do you want to be in this like surgical strike, frickin', you know, SEAL Team 6? I think they're very different sort of models. You can always be in the SEAL Team 6 on the tanker ship, you know, and vice versa. You could have like a coalition of smaller companies trying to do stuff. There's some really interesting things happening in open source, especially around stable diffusion, where you see sort of that happening, where it's like sort of this more distributed model of a bunch of like speedboats sort of fleshing out a space much faster than one or two tanker ships could have done in isolation, just because they're like, you know, there's like large structured companies with a lot of process and overhead, right? So that's kind of how I think about the world, and I think the world is going to just fall back into that configuration.
I mean, I wanted to digress a little bit, you know, just two questions more, you know, so since you are a fan of Matrix, I'm a fan of Matrix, and you know, today I think we can simulate pretty much all of our senses, you know, and there are people such as Nick Bostrom, Elon Musk, Donald Hoffman, so many others who think that we live in a simulation, you know. What are your views on something like that? Because, you know, today we can do volumetric, we can do virtual reality, and virtual reality with haptic feedback, and in some rudimentary ways we can also still simulate, you know, touch and feel. What are your views on the view that we live in a simulated world?
I mean, it's like one of those things that's impossible to prove, certainly with any kind of reductionist approach, right? But the thought experiment itself is so fascinating. It's like, I think Elon's point that, hey, like, look, given at the current rate of advancement, if we just like extrapolate from here, there's going to be a time where we're, to your point too, like we've got all the modalities of sensing figured out, you know, and then it begs the question, are we in the base layer of the simulation, right? That's like the profound question. I don't freaking know. What I find very fascinating is when you look at notions of things like Maya and Prakriti and like Vedic or South Asian traditions more broadly, sort of a similar theme. And I don't think The Matrix as a movie would have existed, you know, without that philosophy heavily influencing, you know, what that movie turned into. And so like, you know, like, I don't know, but what I would posit is that, like, I think the fabric of reality as purely being something that we can slice and dice and measure with our like feeble sensing systems just feels wrong to me. And, you know, maybe we'll figure this stuff out, but I think the way, you know, the knowledge always works is you expand this new chasm of knowledge, and then you find another mountain to climb where it's like kind of this black box and we don't quite know what's going to happen yet. So that's kind of my take on it, is like, and so like when I come back to the notion of karma, that's like super fascinating to me. It's like on one dystopian end, you can call that like the Chinese, like, you know, social credit score, right? Like where everything you do, you know, bumps up and bumps down your interaction, or those Black Mirror messages where like, oh, you know, every person you meet, you can swipe left and right and your rating kind of dynamically adjusts. On the other hand, like maybe there's something like that underpinning the universe itself, right? And maybe that's karma, and maybe that's why like, you know, good begets good, you know, whether it's like, what is it? Like even in Abrahamic traditions, it's like, as you sow, so shall you reap, right? Like all these concepts, and like whether, who knows what timelines those type of things play out by, but I've certainly found that if you do good kind of happens upon you. And, you know, I think maybe if we are living in a simulation, it's already implementing these things, and perhaps these ancient traditions were able to, I don't know, like I certainly find it fascinating how like you've got these monks that can like control parasympathetic functions and go into these like deep meditative states to the point where scientists are like, yo, let's put you under an fMRI machine and just like figure out what's going on here. So is that a way of, in quotes, like hacking the simulation? I don't freaking know. But I see these interesting parallels between sort of like modern science and science fiction today, and like, you know, ancient traditions that have been around for thousands and thousands of years. So who knows whether we're in the base simulation, but it certainly does feel like the nature of reality is different than we may be able to perceive it to be.
Right. Bilawal, really appreciate you taking time and being part of the podcast. My last question is obviously, I mean, what we should have started with is the metaverse, which is in
Oh
the hype,
gosh.
the hype cycle, the immersive, persistent, interoperable, decentralized, open world. What do
Oh,
you
good
think
Lord.
that's going to look like in the next 10 years? And what's your roadmap? Since you're out of Google, what comes next for you?
Gosh, so you attached a lot to the metaverse term there. My definition is slightly different. So I'd say here's what I think the metaverse is. Again, like I don't want to argue with Matthew Ball's definition. He's got, his like multi-bullet point, detailed one is like, I kind of view the metaverse to be just like the 3D successor to the 2D internet, right? Like, and one that mirrors the physical world we've been talking about more closely than the digital world does today, right? Like since Xerox PARC, it's been just rectangles upon rectangles. How do we take, how do we connect physical and digital bits and atoms, if you will, in a more intuitive way where we can bring spatial aspects of ourselves, our personality, the way we embody ourselves, the way we interact with others, interact with objects, spaces, places, and things that we love, and bring that into the sort of like computing can operate in a similar fashion. I view them as like both like, this VR mode where you can sort of escape reality, but still explore these like completely fictitious spatial realms. And then one where you layer computing seamlessly on top of reality, the AR side. I'm a little bit more excited and bullish about the latter because I think the likelihood of that turning into sort of this like dystopian, Ready Player One type world is less. What do I mean by that? Is like, I think if we're in VR, we've got headsets on, we're talking to completely fictitious chatbots, we're getting Mountain Dew straight to the vein, right? Like we can end up sort of turning into these like islands of ourselves and still where we're extremely engaged and maybe even productive by some weird definition. But I think it'll disconnect us from this beautiful world that we live in. So I'm super excited about that. I view VR as sort of a replacement for the desktop and console, and then AR as a replacement for the cell phone in our pocket. So I think there's an open question on whether it's centralized or decentralized. To me, that's very orthogonal to the notion of the metaverse. I think the best examples we've seen thus far are largely centralized. One might say the internet is decentralized, but then let's think about the platforms that command lion's share of attention today. They're largely centralized players. There's some benefits when it comes to policing and moderation when it comes to those type of platforms. I don't know, maybe both will coexist and maybe we'll figure out a way to have like, I certainly think it would be cool to have a way have our social graph and the audience we build as a creator. I think this is like a valid concern of like why everyone builds a goddamn mailing list. I think that's super, super interesting to think about so that when your social account, or a platform goes down, your following doesn't go down with you. But I think there's also extremely hard, like engineering problems to solve with the metaverse, especially this like sort of ubiquitous, massively multiplayer, co-present, persistent virtual world, just by virtue of how do you support a large number of concurrent users. I think simple problems like that need a solution. I don't think sharding's an answer. Maybe you can still create very compelling experiences in like shards of like 40, 50, 60, 70, 120 people. But that's not the dream of like, I went to like, what's the festival in Goa? Sunburn, right? Sunburn. Like, how do you go to Sunburn or Coachella with all your friends and it feels like the real thing? I think there's a lot of hard problems to solve there. So how do I think it'll evolve? The way I think it'll evolve is sort of like layers of capabilities stacking on top of each other on the platform side. But I think there's been almost too much of an emphasis on platform, and we're missing, as you mentioned earlier, sort of the killer app. And I think the places where I see the best examples of, in quotes, the killer apps are things like Creative Mode and Fortnite, doing like a Super Bowl halftime show with Ariana Grande, like a halftime show that was bigger than a Super Bowl halftime show. Or Roblox, which is the world's largest UGC 3D platform, VR chat, which is sort of maybe the more chaotic Reddit version of all of this stuff. So I think some really, really interesting things there. In terms of what's next for me and what I'm most excited about, I'm excited to be on a speedboat and see how creative technology permeates both this generative AI side and this metaverse side. I've sort of had a foot in both worlds and I intend to keep it that way. And what I'm most excited about is providing a more like utopian, positive depiction of what the future looks like. I think everyone's super gung-ho about like doomerism right now. I think that gets a lot of clicks. I get it. And I kind of want to figure out like what is the opposite of Black Mirror? Like what is that like optimistic vision of the future that's also pragmatic and gets both creatives and platforms super excited about this world. So that's half of my focus. And the other half of my focus will be working with awesome creation tool companies, with awesome brands, and advising a small number of startups. So if you're listening to this and you fall into one of those buckets and you're interested in working with me, hit me up. You can look me up. I'm sure we'll plug my contact information in the description below. But yeah, that's a little bit of my take on the metaverse. And yeah, what's cooking next for me?
Lovely. Bilawal, really appreciate you taking time and being part of the podcast. I'm sure your support, advice, mentorship to startups and people who are doing new stuff would be immense. So I'm going to obviously link all your connections, your email below. Wish you the very best for your journey onwards. And to my listeners, if you like what you see in here, then please press the subscribe button. Until next time, see you guys. Bye-bye.
Hit the like button too, for the algorithm. Let's go. Cool. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.